Before we continue our read of this incredible book, I wanted to inform listeners a little bit about the Apocrypha of John. There are a total of 5 translations. 2 of those translations are the same, except one is short version and the other is the long version. You can take from the Stephen Davies translation. This is the translation we recommend to readers meeting the text for the first time. So it's a more simplistic translation that doesn't have text broken up into verses. The second one is from Marvin Mayer, who also has translated a number of the other books that we've read on this YouTube channel. Dr. Marvin Mayer was a preeminent authority on Nag Hammadi texts and translations. The third translation is Frederick Weiss, and this is originally prepared for the Coptic Gnostic Library Project. That's the one from which I'm reading here on this YouTube channel. It's considered the scholarly edition. It also provides comparative translations of each of the 4 surviving manuscripts. So essentially they've gone through all of the 4 different manuscripts of the Secret Book of John and pulled together a comparative translation, meaning that they've created the most concise matching example of the Secret Book of John possible. And there are 2 versions of that. That's the short version, which is from Codex number 3. Also from Codex number 2 is the long version. Part of it's from Codex number 4 as well. So this is the one I thought would be the most comprehensive. So this is the one from which I am reading. So with that understanding, you can then go back and look at the different translations, as you may have different interpretations on some specific words. And as pointed out by one of our viewers, 1 or 2 words can in fact make quite a bit of difference in terms of the way we understand a particular verse or even passage. Interpretations of Scripture, their holy Scriptures, as well as even different translations of those Scriptures. So what we want to get from this are not necessarily the nuanced differences, or even in some cases they may be even a little more than nuance, but I want to remind you that the main core tenets from the text or that particular thought is most important, and that's what we want to find what we have in common more than what we don't have in common. There are going to be people that disagree, and this has been the case even since the early Gnostic Church, when you have Marcion had his understanding, Valentinus had his, so forth and so on. And this is even the case within Proto-Orthodox Christianity, as they have many sects, many denominations. Again, I'm doing my own understanding of these texts based upon what I've read from canonical text as well as Gnostic texts, along with my own personal knowledge and hopefully wisdom and experience I've gained through the course of what I've read and understood and experienced in my own personal life. I'm hoping that also with a little bit of divine God speaking through me or inspiration, that I'm able to share with you these texts in a way that will bring forth a broadening understanding of what they're saying or might have said at the time they were written or intended to say during the time of writing, as best as I can. If you are interested in how to have access to all of the Gnostic texts, the Nag Hammadi library, a good place to go would be gnosis.org. You're always welcome to read any of these texts. Gnosticism is not about dogmatism. We're the opposite of dogmatism. We present our cosmogony, our eschatology, understanding of the cosmos and mankind, humankind, where we came from, where we're going, things like that. And I'm presuming those have come here have found Gnosticism to reflect back to them truth in a way that nothing else that they found thus far has. With that, let's go ahead and pick up, and we're now again in video number 8, and we're picking up from verse number 18 from the Michael Waldstein and Frederick Weiss translation, which is the scholarly edition, and this is again the long version. Now, one of the things about Gnostic text is that they're like building blocks. Many of the different books are not written in the same fashion that you would find a number of the books out of the Bible. For example, you could start right in the middle of one of the Old Testament books, and you wouldn't necessarily lose your way, as there are many different stories within a particular book within the Old Testament. For example, you could pick up Genesis even and start, I don't know, a third of the way, and then it would bring up the Israelites and their captivity within Israel, for example. And you wouldn't necessarily be losing any story. But with Gnostic text, because a lot of them are expositions, if you will, it is important that you read it from beginning to end, because they're building blocks. And it's much in the way of, an example might be Revelations is another example of that, or even the Gospels. You could read the Gospels, but you wouldn't be getting the full impact of Christ's story in in any of the Gospels if you didn't read it from the beginning to the end. And that's really what a lot of the Gnostic texts are like. So I do encourage you to go back to really get a full understanding of how we got here, because each one of these are building blocks to have a fuller understanding and appreciation of what's being said here. These books have not been present with us, and they're not part of our culture. They've been present with us for over 2,000 years, and as a result, or nearly 2,000 years. So as a result, they're not second nature to us. Maybe those that had listened to the last video saw a lot of words that were very foreign to pretty much any language group you could think of on the planet. All of the names of these angels and demons were very difficult for anyone to have to pronounce. But with familiarity and more people taking a stab at trying to say them, then a cultural sort of colloquial pronunciation will develop. So let's pick up on verse number 18. It says, and their product was completely inactive and motionless for a long time. So what's referring to, this product, is all of the angels and demons had come together to form the physical body humans. Even the demons went about and used their tools of heat, cold, dampness, and air to try to get this human that was just lying there, kind of a Frankenstein kind of human being lying on the ground, to animate itself. And it wasn't doing so. And the Demi-urge was confounded, like, what's going on here? Why can't I get this thing to move? And so here's the thing. It says, and their product was completely inactive and motionless for a long time. So here they are. A long time would imply that they probably were all, kind of in a huddle around this table, if you could think of it, trying to figure it out, scratching their heads. Why can't we get this thing to move? But when the mother wanted to retrieve the power, and you remember Sophia had come from the pleroma into the ninth, into the seventh realm, into these lower realms, the corrupt realm, the matrix. She came in here to retrieve the spirit that she had placed into her birth, the Demi-urge. This was not going to be possible because that was residing in the Demi-urge. And the Demi-urge, the chief ruler, was not having it. He was not going to have her approaching her. So how was she going to get that spirit back? So she goes to the mother father and says, look, I have a dilemma here. What can we do here? So it says, but when the mother wanted to retrieve the power which she had given to the chief ruler, she entreated the mother father of all. In other words, like, she went to them. Okay, obviously this would be the place to go. They created everything, emanated everything, so they have all wisdom. The one who possesses great mercy, following the holy design. This is what was their answer. Now remember the pentad, the 5 parts of all creation, which was talked about, I believe it was in the first or second video, of the 5 main attributes of God, the formula to create everything, the pentad. This is the 5 lights. And those are mentioned as truth, everlasting life, incorruptibility, sometimes called indestructibility, truth, and thought. So those 5 lights, as it says here, the monad, the mother father, sent the 5 lights down to the place of the angels of the chief ruler. And they said to the chief ruler, they advised him, with the goal of extracting the power of the mother. This is what they said to him. And they said to Yaldabaoth, breathe into his face by your spirit, and his body will rise. So that's what Yaldabaoth did. He breathed into the lifeless body of this human. And into his face he blew his spirit, without realizing it, which is the power of his mother. He did not understand because he dwells in ignorance. Essentially, what he did is he transferred his light into humankind, gnosis, essentially. And as a result of that, mankind would come to see, and at some point in their evolution, become aware of what had happened, the whole history. And that's where the tree of knowledge of good and evil comes into play, because that's when the serpent, which is the Christ moving in the serpent through the seraphim, who embodies the serpent, and reveals to Eve and Adam the history of humanity and their origins and gnosis. Of course, mankind's going to rise up at some point when everybody realizes this, that the Yaldabaoth is a fraud god and has robbed everybody. And of course, he's a very wrathful god, an angry god, and he's a liar, so forth and so on. He's not the true father. They weren't lying. This is certainly the only way in which humans would be animated. And so this is what Yaldabaoth did. He breathed into his face by his spirit, and his body will arise. And into his face he blew his spirit, which is the power of his mother. He did not understand because he dwells in ignorance. And the power of the mother left Yaldabaoth and went into the psychic body. This is the soul body, okay? So there was no spirit at that point, but the spirit went into the body, the flesh and the soul. It went into that. It went into the psychic body that they had made according to the likeness of the one who exists from the beginning. The body moved and gained power, and it was luminous. And in that moment, the rest of the powers became jealous, for it was because of them all that he had come into being, and they had given their power to the human. So it's at that moment they realized that it was like that uh-oh moment. It's like, dull moment, and in The Simpsons, dull moment that they had, that we just been tricked. And there really wasn't a trick by the mother-father, because the mother-father was just telling the truth. And so Yaldabaoth went about and saw this, and he became very jealous of the humans, and his followers, all the archons, also became jealous. Yet his understanding was stronger than those who had made him, and greater even than the chief ruler. At this point, this human being has gnosis. It wakes up, and it knows right away everything. It knows. It knows the chief ruler. It knows the mother, father. It knows Sophia. It understands, because gnosis was breathed into this first human being in this plane, the first flesh so human. When they understood that he was luminous, meaning he understood, could think better than they did, and was naked of evil. Now, when it means naked of evil, it's saying here that there was no division within him. He was whole. They picked him up and threw him down into the lowest part of all matter. So they first created him in the seventh heaven, or the seventh realm, which is heaven. I suppose at that point their intention was, well, we're just going to keep him here. But when they finally created this man, they realized we can't keep him here. This being is just too powerful. So they cast him down into a type of hell, and that's where we are today. The flesh humans are living in hell, and anywhere from the first to the third realm is hell. And our goal is, of course, to rise up, to ascend back to beyond the ninth realm, which is the pleroma. Now, I'm going to explain that to you at some point in more detail in future videos, but understand that brilliant questions out there, and I really appreciate it, because all the questions that you ask help me to understand how I can help you understand more clearly what's missing in whatever I'm explicating or explaining about these texts. I'm doing whatever I can to try to make sure I'm covering everything, but when you guys ask questions, and brilliant questions by the way, then it really helps me to know how I can expand on this in a way that really answers to what's being said here. But understand that there are different realms, and they're all the way up to the ninth realm, and then after the ninth heaven is the pleroma. One question that came up is where do humans reside? If we are three parts, if we're flesh, soul, and body, where do we reside? Now keep in mind, as I said before, even Christ had said that the kingdom of God is within you, or the kingdom of heaven, meaning the pleroma, is inside of you. So it's not as though heaven is somewhere way out there. The kingdom of heaven, or the pleroma, is actually in you. It's the gnosis, it's the light. And some people are woke, and that light is not dormant, and others are awoke. And those that are awoke, they have gnosis. Those that are not awoke, they still have light, they still have the kingdom of God within them, but they don't have gnosis. They're not aware of that light. It's dormant. And so they don't have access to it. They don't have power to it. The thing to understand about the question, where do we reside, is that you can reside simultaneously in all of these realms. For example, if you have an individual has gnosis, then they can reside in the third realm that is here on earth, the flesh realm, and they can also reside in the eighth and ninth realm. And here's why: because when you have gnosis, what happens is that gnosis expands outward, it envelopes you, and then you're living in that light. You're actually living in that light, and that light, that expression, is the pleroma, and it's in everything. This flesh realm is shrouding that light. It's what it's doing, the darkness. And the light is trying to burn itself through. It's illuminating luminescent beings, is because the light is actually, energy is burning away the flesh. And so the same thing with all the planets and all of the gases and everything. They're burning it. It's burning it out because it can't contain that power, you see. That's what you have to understand, is when you pass away in this incarnation, you'll go back to heaven to be judged. And by the Demi-urge, your body and soul will be judged. And then if your body and soul still has attachments, it will go back to this realm. When you die, your body and soul go to heaven, or where the Demi-urge resides, but your spirit goes back to the pleroma. If the individual decides to come back to this realm, the flesh realm, then what happens is spirit goes back through the firmament, which is where the waters are, and waters represents where memory is. Ascension, going back through the firmaments or the water, brings memory back, or remembrance. And going opposite to that, descension creates amnesia or forgetfulness. So the spirit forgets again about the pleroma, goes back into the flesh body, the soul body, and comes back to earth. So it's born as a child with no knowledge. It's completely ignorant. It's a blank face, basically. So this is what's happening. The question about where we are, like our home, is about where we go when we pass away. Now, if we've managed to create a holy soul, then we go to the eighth realm, and that's where the holy souls reside, and that's where the aeon, I believe it's Ario, I want to say it's Ario, or it's Devitai, but it's one of those, I can't remember, but one of those is where that aeon resides, and it's over that domain that you will be your home. Now, once you've reached holy soul level, that becomes your home. Your home is no longer this realm once you reach the holy soul level. If you have not reached the holy soul level, then your domain is from seventh heaven downward, and you could reside on earth, or you could even become an archon and rule with the Demi-urge. And that's where the leaders of this world, many of them, they find themselves being ruled by and led by the Demi-urge and its archons. And so they then go about and have authority and power over this planet. One other thing I wanted to describe was about what is the difference between the soul and the spirit. There was another really great question. The word soul actually comes from a Proto-Germanic word, which means sea. Now, I believe that's called Saiwas. The soul is thought to be the spirit falling through the firmament, is between the heaven and the pleroma. So there's a firmament. There's the eighth and ninth realm, which is where the firmament is, and that is thought to be a realm of water. Essentially, the soul is much like the spirit, except it's a watered down version, if you want to think of it that way, of the spirit. It is a weakened form of the spirit. It's where memory lies. Memory is water and memory are synonymous to each other in the realm of Gnostic understanding. And so when the spirit leaves the pleroma and it wants to come here to experience the urge of flesh, that bridge from the spirit into the earth realm, that spirit becomes dim or becomes asleep. That remembrance of who you are, that vague impulse that envelopes you, is an artificial construct that the Demi-urge creates so that you will believe that that is who you are. Because what the Demi-urge does, whenever it saw the pleroma on the firmament, when he became frightened and he looked up at the firmament, he saw a vague impression of the pleroma. He saw everyone's spirit that was in the pleroma. And so he then said, I need to create a mock-up of each one of these. So that's what the soul is. It's a mock-up. It's an artificial spirit, basically, that the Demi-urge creates so that he can bind us here. Because what happens is humans will start to think that's who they are. The flesh is the one that tells us or gives us senses and perception. The soul is the body that defines for us meaning. So it goes about and says, this is who I am, a type of identity, and it creates ego. This is what the soul does. But the soul also is going to help you remember who you really are, because remember that this is a mock-up. It's a facsimile. Even though it's a facsimile, it's very close. It's so close to the original true spirit that it tricks people into thinking this is who they are. And so even though the Demi-urge is creating an artificial spirit called the soul, it's still good to rise up to the level of a holy soul. In other words, that's the eighth realm. That's even above the Demi-urge. Because when you do that, you're moving toward remembering yourself, your true spirit. I hope that makes it clear. I'll continue to explain this more in detail and remind you so that it'll become more second nature to you to know what is the difference between the soul and the spirit. Now, all of that's really essential for you to understand, because we're going to go more deep into this, and it's going to start to bring about some of these details, like the idea of artificial spirit, so forth and so on. And it says, and after they threw him down into the lowest part of all matter, next happened, but the Blessed One, the Mother Father, the beneficent and merciful, had mercy upon the mother's power that had been brought forth from the chief ruler. In other words, he had mercy on this human being, this flesh being, that even the Mother Father did not create, but emanated the light within. But the Demi-urge used everything that was already created to fashion this flesh human. And so the Mother Father had mercy on this. He brought forth from the chief ruler, lest yet again they might have power over the psychic and perceptible body. In other words, he knew that humans had to be redeemed, because if they just sat there forever, the chief ruler would figure out a way to steal that light back. So through his beneficent spirit and his great mercy, he sent a helper to Adam. She is a luminous epinoia, and remember, epinoia is knowledge of sort, who is from him and who was called light. And this epinoia is the mother of all life. Essentially, you're going to get that. So that was residing in the Adam. And so the Adam had fullness to him, this Adam, as he was both male and female, because epinoia resided in the Adam. So that's when it talks about in the book of Thomas, it talks about there will be perfection and fullness when woman becomes as the man. What's referring to is that the original being was a man. In other words, it wasn't about genitals, but it was that the being that was created, full in that it could both assert itself and reflect back on itself, so that it wouldn't be foolhardy, and just be spontaneous and be led by its urges. It had the capacity to be wise, in other words, had Sophia within, the epinoia. This is why Barbella is referred to Sophia, which is the epinoia, which is thought, in that it has foreknowledge and thinks about things, and then reflection, which is the Sophia. She's also called epinoia. So this is the feminine aspect, so the male can be both receptacle and projectile and have a balanced being. This is how he was at the beginning. And she is the luminous epinoia, who is from him and who is called life. It is she who aids the whole creation by toiling with him, guiding him by correction toward his fullness, and teaching him about the descent of the seed, and teaching him about the path of ascent, the path which it had come down. The epinoia of the light was hidden in Adam in order that the rulers might not know, but epinoia existed as a correction for the deficiency of the mother. So remember, when Sophia had realized what she had done, there was no way she's going to be able to take in all of the ineffable, the monad. That was a deficiency to her, because she wanted to experience the fullness of God. So in order to correct that, in order to bring her back to fullness, to help her complete her full acceptance of self, this is what occurred. She was that body to that. She was the receptacle for mankind to achieve that, not only for themselves, but also in so doing would fulfill her. In other words, it would bring about a purpose behind something that she thought was purposeless or meaningless or a mistake. The true Father would rectify it to show her that it was not a mistake in the end, and it had a meaning to it, a fullness to it. And the human appeared because of the shadow of the light which exists within him. So that, again, the shadow of the light is the dim light, the soul. That's the artificial light. This human appeared because of that. So the body appeared, the flesh part, the flesh soul part appeared, because it was in the realm of the kanoma, and it was partially created by the Demi-urge. And his thought was superior to all those who had created him. When they looked up, they saw that his thought was superior, and they took counsel with the whole host of the rulers and the angels. So in other words, they were getting like freaked out. Okay, let's get together. Let's huddle. We need to do something. They're freaking out at this point. They took some fire, earth, and water, and this is the elements I was telling you about. The facsimile of the four elements that you found in the four lights that stood with Christ in the pleroma. This parallel or dim example in the pleroma is the Jehovah God. This is what it's talking about. They go about to create a Jehovah God, which is the four elements of the Hebrew letters, fire, earth, water, and air. And this is where he's called the God of the airs, or the four winds. And so it's talking about. And so they took some fire, earth, and water. They mixed them together with each other and the four fiery winds. And they wrought them together and made a great disturbance. And that great disturbance is Jehovah. And they enclosed him in the shadow of death, in order that they might yet again form from earth, water, fire, and spirit, a thing from matter. So they were going to try to capture the spirit through creating this thing called flesh. So they had already created the soul body and all of these other parts of the soul body, and the spirit was luminous. So they said, well, let's do it again. So it's kind of like a double casing, and let's find out if we can prevent this light from being luminous and getting out. And so then, as a result, they said, well, let's introduce this concept called death. Let's get rid of him. Let him only live so long. And so this is where Jehovah comes in. And this is the aeon of death, life and death. He says, I'm the Alpha and Omega. I'm the God of, life and death, good and evil. This is where the idea of Jehovah comes about, the aeon of Jehovah, this concept known as, and remember, aeons are expressions and concepts of divine creatures or beings or gods. In this case, whether it's the true Father or the Demi-urge, it's still a type of aeon. And so they enclosed him in the shadow of death in order that they might yet again form from earth, water, fire, and spirit, or air, a thing from matter, which is the ignorance of the darkness, desire, and their counterfeit spirit. This is the tomb of the molding of the body with which the robbers clothed the human, the chain of forgetfulness. And that's why we always forget. Because you notice the longer you live, the more and more wisdom you gain. So the way they thought, they huddled together and they come up with a solution. Well, if he just keeps gaining more and more wisdom through more and more experience, why don't we stop him from, gaining more wisdom by just putting a clock on him, a time, an expiration date on him, so that he can't keep gaining wisdom. And he came to be a mortal man. This is the one who came down first and the first partition. The epinoia of the light who was in him is the one who will awaken his thinking. So this was the first example being created in this realm. Now, it wasn't the first perfect human. The first perfect human was already created in the pleroma that resides with the Christ and Armazil. But many of those were enticed to come into this realm. So their spirits entered into these flesh forms, or in these flesh bodies. So whatever the Sophia had given her light over to the Demi-urge, those were already the spirits of humans that came from the perfect realm and resided in the Demi-urge, and then he transferred it into all of these flesh soul beings. The souls resulted because of the going through the firmament of forgetfulness, and it further was exasperated by the idea of death that was introduced for the first time. This is the first time that death had come about. You see, death had never existed prior. And the rulers took him and they placed him in paradise, and this is the Garden of Eden. And he said to him, "Eat that is in idleness, for indeed their delight is bitter and their beauty is licentious." So, in other words, you may eat of everything that doesn't result in any progress. It's just going to remain idle. So eating here can be referred to, actual eating like we humans do, or it could be consuming of experience, So the way you interpret that is not as important as understanding you are what you eat, so to speak. For indeed their delight is bitter, and their beauty is licentious. So, for their delight is deception, and their trees are impiety, and their fruit is an incurable poison, and their promise is death. And in the midst of paradise they planted the tree of their life. Now, this is where you have two facsimiles set up. You have the tree of life, and you have the tree of good and evil. Now, not the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but the tree of life here that's being planted in the midst is not the same tree of life that is the Christ. This is a different tree of life that brings about all of this stuff talked about before. Bitterness, idleness, deception, impiety, incurable poison, and the promise of death. That's what that tree does, and that's what we are partaking of in this realm. We're partaking of the flesh realm, and that tree leads to death. And we're also partaking of good and evil as a result of that. So we're partaking of those two trees that are from the Demi-urge. But I will teach you what the mystery of their life is, the plan they made with each other, the likeness of their spirit. Christ is saying, I'm going to show you a way out of this. I'm going to show you their plan, what they're planning to do, so that you're going to be ahead of them. You see, that's what he's saying, and what this all means and how to get out of it. For its root is bitterness, and its branches are death. Its shade is hate and deception, dwells in its leaves. It seems quite simple, it seems allegorical, it seems like a little poem, but the reality is these are the things that when you partake of these fruits, they bring about death. And that is, when you have bitterness, when you have hate, when you're deceptive, and those things, it produces the fruit that leads to death. And its blossom is the anointment of evil, or in other words, the anointment of division. It creates division and schizophrenia. And its fruit is death, and desire is its seed. In other words, you're never going to feel fulfilled. You're always going to feel like you need more and more and more. And you're going to have lust, and you're going to have envy, and you're going to have covetousness, and you're going to have this urgency to have reputation and competing with the Joneses, because you're trying to fill something with things that are not ever going to fill that void in you. And it blossoms from darkness, meaning ignorance. The dwelling place of those who taste from it is Hades, and the dark is their resting place. But what they call the tree of the knowledge of what is good and evil is the epinoia of the light. This is completely 180 from proto-Orthodox understanding of this tree called the knowledge of what is good and evil. Christ is saying to John, this tree is going to bring you knowledge. They, the rulers, remained in front of it in order that he might not look up to its fullness and come to know the nakedness of his shamefulness. So when it talks about being naked, it means being aware and awake that you're vulnerable and you're not clothed with truth. You don't have the garment of truth around you, and so you need to partake of it. This is what it's referring to. And so Christ is telling him the way out of this is to partake of knowledge, to partake of gnosis, to know that the Demi-urge is not your God. It's a false God. And all of his lies about judgment and sin and hellfire and going to this dichotomy of heaven or hell, death and disdain and wretchedness, these are all lies. The Demi-urge wants to prevent you from ever seeing those lies. But when you partake of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you awoken to who this God is. He's the God of good and evil. And you see what good is and what is evil. That thing that is whole versus that thing that divides and conquers, you see. And it goes on and says, but as for me, I set them right so that they would eat. In other words, Christ is saying, I'm the one that made sure that you're going to partake of this fruit. I am the one that was a serpent in the garden. That's what he's essentially saying. And I said to the Savior, Lord, was it not the snake who taught Adam so that he would eat? The Savior laughed and said, the snake taught them to eat from a wicked desire to sow, which belongs to destruction, in order that he, Adam, would become useful to it. So in other words, the seraphim that was working for the Demi-urge, you have to remember the seraphim were the angels, the three-winged angelic beings. They were archons. So they were part of being deceptive, but they were in the spirit to be moved by Christ, to be embodied into a serpent. So it's much like the Judas story. You see, this is what the serpent was in the garden. It was like a Judas. The Christ within, or God within, was working in Judas. So too it was working in the snake, or the serpent, or the seraphim, that was embodied in the form of a snake in the garden and spoke to Eve. And it knew that it was disobedient to it, meaning not to God, but to the Demi-urge, because Christ moved in him. Because the light of epinoia dwelled in him, making him more correct in his thinking than the chief ruler, or one of the archons, one of the seraphims, and I believe he was named earlier. He was the one that had the Christhood. Can't remember his name, but it is mentioned earlier. When I remember it, I'll let you know. But I believe it was that particular archon that rebelled against the Demi-urge, and he was because he was moved. Epinoia moved in him; it was dwelling in him, and he then went. The Christ moved in that seraphim, moved that seraphim to embody itself. Because you have to remember, archons and angels and demons don't have bodies; they have soul bodies. They don't have flesh bodies. They have soul bodies, and they have spirits in them, but those spirits are dormant. They don't remember, so their spirits act out an artificial spirit that guides them, which is their soul body. But in order for them to take any kind of flesh, they have to embody another flesh body. They have to borrow it, essentially. So that's what the seraphim did by entering into a serpent or a snake. That's what happened, but it was moved by Christ through a seraphim into a snake's body. And I don't know if it was actually a snake or was just a term, because it's a serpent. Could be a wise being. It even could be that the seraphim showed up as an even angel. That's possible as well. Seraphim are sometimes referred to as serpent. We get the word serpent from seraphim, by the way. And he wanted to bring out the power which he had given to him. And he brought a trance upon Adam. Now this is the Demi-urge stepping in. And he said to the Savior, what is the trance? Now remember, the trance here is when God puts Adam to sleep and takes Eve from his rib. Remember that. And that's our understanding from the Orthodox Church in the understanding of chapter 2 of Genesis. And here he said, it is not as Moses wrote as you heard, for he said in his first book that he laid him down in sleep, but rather concerning his sensibility. For indeed it is said by the prophet, I will make their hearts heavy, so that they might neither give heed nor see. So what does it mean here? It's meaning that the Demi-urge made it so that the first Adam, or the first man in this incarnation, the Kanoma, would feel incomplete and would feel sad and would feel heavy in their hearts and would feel disconcerted and would sort of think of it as just feeling like you're not complete and you feel disoriented. Really, that's what he's saying. I will make their hearts heavy so that they might neither give heed nor see. So they get blinded, they get distracted. You see. Then the epinoia of the light hid in him. At this point, the epinoia knows that the chief ruler is coming for the epinoia, wants to get it back. And the chief ruler wanted to bring her from his rib, but the epinoia of the light is not graspable. So the foolish chief ruler thought he could get it from the flesh, and so he essentially goes about and does his DNA scientific work in the laboratory. And he takes part of the DNA from the rib and he forms a woman. So basically he's doing the best mock-up of the receptacle, the spiritual feminine in flesh form. Although the dark pursued her, it did not lay hold of her. In other words, the epinoia, he couldn't grasp the epinoia. He couldn't get it back. He couldn't get that light back. And he brought forth a part of his power from him, Adam. So instead what he did is he took part of Adam's own feminine self, only a part of the epinoia. So some of the epinoia was taken back, but not all of it. Epinoia was able to escape most of it, but he was able to get some of it through Adam because it was in Adam's essence, you see. And he created another molded form in a woman's shape according to the image of Epinoia, who had appeared to him. Now keep in mind that originally humans were created as a he, and the he was balanced. It had male and female already. It was androgynous. It had no need for sex and intercourse and babies and birthing. It was able to have autogenesis. It could bring about its own creations when it was due. When it felt the season was right, it would generate that on its own with its consort. And into the model form of womanhood, he put the part of which he had taken from the power of the human, not his rib, as Moses said. So this is the part he took from him. He took the womanhood, or the feminine aspect, and he saw the woman beside him. Immediately the luminous epinoia appeared, for she had uncovered the veil which had been on his understanding. So in other words, she was saying, I've got to make Adam aware because he's gone into a stupor. So I've got to make myself present to him, so he's not distracted into thinking this flesh example is the same as epinoia. He became sober from the drunkenness of the darkness, and he recognized his likeness. And this is where epinoia, even though she's doing the best attempt of showing the purest form of the feminine, she can only represent herself through the impartial, or the incompleted form, which is the feminine womanhood, or the woman. And he said, and this is the first Adam, now this is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. Because of this, man will leave his father and his mother, and he will cling to his wife, and they will no longer be two, but a single flesh. For his partner will be sent to him, and he will leave his father and his mother. So this is all symbolic, because this is the point at which the Adam leaves the true mother-father. And in fact, that is actually contrary to what was intended from the beginning. You see, from the beginning, the human man, the perfect man in the pleroma, was not to leave the mother and father, was forever be in the pleroma. So this concept of leaving the mother and father is what separates everyone, you see. And this wasn't God speaking, this wasn't epinoia speaking, but this was Adam, who was in a drunken state, speaking. He was now accepting this idea of genetics and Genesis, and he was now placed into the genetic tree of generations, and creating or having sex and intercourse to create babies, and the womb and the pain of bringing forth offspring and things like this. And this was all necessary to keep mankind distracted, you see, and to be stuck in flesh and to lust after flesh and things like this. So this is what it's saying, essentially. And that's what it's referring to. Now, this is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. Because of this, man will leave his father and his mother, and he will cling to his wife. And cling is not a healthy thing, you see. This is kind of possessiveness, a kind of neediness. He's clinging to his wife. And they will no longer be two, you see, but it's single flesh. So they're no longer going to have that objectivity. They're no longer consorts. And that's, like of course the proto-Orthodox Church was trying to teach you that this is a good thing, and this is what you should do, and this is what intended by God. In fact, this is not what's intended by God. It wasn't even said by God. This was said by a drunken Adam who is in a state of darkness. We're almost done here on this one, and we'll go down to verse 22, and we'll stop there. It is our sister Sophia who came down in innocence in order that she might correct her deficiency. Because of this, she was called Zoe, life, the mother of the living, by pronoia of the authority of heaven, and to him and through her they tasted the perfect knowledge. So this is where it all started. Sophia was the one that started all of this out of innocence, in order that everything can be corrected. She came to this realm. In the form of an eagle, I appeared on the tree of knowledge. Now, this is different from the Genesis, where it says in the form of a serpent. So what gives here? This is referring to transformation. This is referring to Scorpio, the zodiac sign, the constellation Scorpio. This is referring to Christ fulfilling that archetype. And why is it the archetype of Scorpio? Because Scorpio's Hades, and Scorpio is looking at your authenticity, and Scorpio is looking at truth. And also Scorpio is looking at going down to the pits of hell in order to find your true self. It's also looking for transformation, transforming yourself from the self that is self-deceiving and is an illusion, and to the true self, an awakening. This is what the eagle represents. So it's not even about an actual snake or an actual eagle. If you want to see it that way, that's fine. That's fine if you want to see it that way. But more important than that is, what is the symbol? What is the meaning behind that? And the meaning here is that this represents the constellation Scorpio and all of its archetypes. It's the light of the remembrance. Remember, it's the light of perception. And that's what I was talking about under the aeon of the water aeon, which I believe was, I want to say it was Rio. And that second one was called perception. That's Scorpio. And that's the eagle. That's the serpent. Sometimes called the serpent, sometimes called the eagle, sometimes even called a lizard, even a worm, just depending on what state it's in terms of its ascension. I appeared, meaning Christ's energy, Christ's essence, on the tree of knowledge, which is the epinoia from the pure, luminous pronoia. And remember, pronoia is to promote that energy of truth. I appeared in that luminous promotion of truth, so that I might teach them and awaken them from the depth of the sleep. For they were both in a fallen state, and they recognized their nakedness. And I believe it should have said here, some of these words I noticed are not correct, but I believe it says, and they did not recognize their nakedness. Or maybe it says that so that they may recognize their nakedness. Epinoia appeared to them as light, awakening their thought. And so this is also, you have to understand that when Christ comes and he is in concord with his consort, they come together. Sophia and Christ come together. So some will, within Gnostic texts, or Gnostic understanding, will argue, no, it was Sophia that was in the tree. And others will say, no, it was Christ. Because here it says I, which means Christ who's speaking. And other times it says, no, epinoia. So which one is it? Well, guess what? It's both. Because they come together. They never leave each other. So that's why when Sophia went off and did this without the Christ, this was a major event, you see, and it left her weeping, and it was just beyond anything that any of the aeons had done up to that point. That was the first one to have done that. And so that's why it was so resoundingly significant and resulted in all of this, you see. All right, I'm going to leave it there, and we'll pick up on the next video on verse number 22.